to our guest, Michelle. Michelle, are you with us now?
Hey, I am here.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for
So
having
this
me.
is our third NetWeaver dialogue. And of course, Michelle knows the rest of our systems weavers because we've been hanging out quite a bit over the last year. We had a series of deep conversations among the people who you've met already and some of the folks you're going to meet in the future, Sarah Shanahan and Curtis Ogden. And so Michelle and I, we go way back. We met in Boise at the beginning of FactNet. God, when was that? 10 years ago?
2013.
2013. Yeah. And we've been talking ever since. And I've learned so much from Michelle and her work with the Fire Adapted Community Learning Network, also known as FactNet. And recently we were in Santiago, which I'm actually going to tell you a little about later in the class at a meeting to explore transformation practices. And we focus specifically on learning networks and the potential of learning networks as a transformations practice. So yeah, we have a long history. And I want to give you a brief intro before we go into our dialogue. Michelle, you lead as you know, the Fire Adapted Community Learning Network, which is a national network of communities that are learning to live better with wildfire. And it's part of a portfolio of efforts that are supported by the Nature Conservancy and the U.S. Forest Service. And Michelle's focus is to work with members of this network who are operating at a variety of different scales, the local, the state, and the national scale, all committed to advancing wildfire resilience. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today as well. And so Michelle is inspired by this work about redefining and reclaiming people's relationship with wildfire, the paradigm shifts that we're talking about, those deep paradigm shifts that are at the ultimate goal of really substantial systems change is what the Fire Adapted Community Learning Network is all about. And Michelle also serves as the Deputy Director of the Watershed Center, which supports stewardship of the Klamath-Siskiyou, I hope I pronounced it right, mountains of Northern California. And actually, I wanted to show, I pulled up, before we get into our conversation, I wanted to just show where you are at in relationship to what is underway now. So here's a map of Hayfork. Michelle, are you on this map?
I am. I'm actually I'm on Circle Drive on the left there in that neighborhood.
Right here.
Yes, we have a vast downtown. We're actually a very, very small community of about 2,000 people nestled in the National Forest. So I think, I was thinking about where I'm calling in to you all from today, and I learned a new word today that I don't love, but I read the first news article to call this fire a gigafire. So the largest fire in California history is currently burning just south of this map. It's called the August Complex, and the news outlets are apparently calling this a gigafire because it's over 1 million acres. It's a fire that's burning in 8 different counties, and would take about 7 hours to drive the perimeter of the fire. So it's bigger than the state of Rhode Island, the size of the fire, if that gives you guys some context.
So this map is from the National Interagency Fire Center. And so I want to zoom out from Hayfork and show exactly what you're talking about, Michelle. Is that the gigafire right there?
It is. That's her. The one to the south, that's the August Complex. Right to the north there, that other big one, that's the Red Salmon Complex. That's right in the Karuk Aboriginal territory, some of our partners in FactNet. And then the Zog fire is that one that's a little bit to the east. And that was a really tragic fire where there were deaths. It just got going over the weekend on Red Flag Day, and people were not able to evacuate in time.
What a moment we live in right now with this incredible number of wildfires burning across the country. Practically unprecedented, and in a way, a moment that you've probably anticipated, dreaded, is something you've been working with the awareness that could occur, and now we're here. How does it feel to be in this moment, Michelle?
Well, I was thinking the other day, Bruce, about a meeting we had in Boise, and you were there along with a couple of our other sort of project partners. And it was sort of a strategy planning meeting that we were having. And one of the questions we were pondering is like, what might trigger a big systems change? And one of the sort of hypotheses that we had was that some enormous sort of tragic fire would happen. And then there would be sort of this call to action, and that agencies might double down on the sort of suppression idea and try to build a super fire agency, or we might be able to offer alternatives to that. And so I have often reflected on that conversation and that kind of choice that I think we're going to be presented with. And I think that moment is on the very near horizon.
Yeah, yeah. Tell us about going back to the origins in 2013. How did FactNet frame this systems change challenge that you're addressing, and that you see this perhaps opportunity to move forward now?
Yeah, so when we first got started with FactNet, I think like many folks working on complex systems change issues, I don't think we knew all of the things that we were going to end up working on. The first thing we identified needing to work on was to start connecting the communities and the people who were already trying to figure out a better way to relate to fire. My own community that Bruce just showed you, Hayfork, we are a natural resource-based economy. We live in a frequent fire forest, and the organization that I work for had been founded in order to manage another disruption that we'd had in our community when our mill shut down and all of our economy went away. And so we knew that it would be really powerful and could create some new alternative ways of relating to fire on a broader scale if we could connect all of those isolated practitioners and organizations who knew that their relationship with fire wasn't working, and letting it be owned under sort of that centralized government controlled system was sort of leading us down, was definitely leading us down a path that was not going to continue, that was going to continue to provide less than ideal outcomes, and in fact, worsening outcomes and further to kind of decay of opportunity to rebuild our relationship with fire. And so we knew as practitioners ourselves that we were not, the connections to other folks were not being facilitated. We knew that the fire management system we had took the opportunity for us to weigh in on how our fires would be managed and to actually actively work in our landscape out of our hands largely. We spend 20 years working with partners locally to collaborate and envision what our landscape would look like. We went through the timber wars in Northern California, which were this really contentious moment that sort of tore communities apart around how we were going to manage our public lands, and so we were sort of recovering from that and at the same time realizing that if we didn't get to have more influence on fire, then all of that work we had done to come out of that kind of timber war mentality and do the collaboration work was going to be potentially burned up in a 2-week operational period. And that all of the visioning and project planning and NEPA compliance planning and all of the work that we were putting in was going to sort of be erased, and that we were going to have to start over in terms of our vision and our all of that same process of project planning again. And so we thought we need to sort of get in on a different part of this system. We can't just sit back and let other people make all these decisions in the moment that are rewriting our fire future. And so we were lucky enough to already be engaged. I think you all have heard from Lynn Decker, my colleague who had run the Fire Learning Network. So we were connected to some other people working on these issues, but we knew that sort of the lens of community and community resilience wasn't the starting place for a lot of folks who were looking at the fire management kind of sector. Most people who were looking at fire management were looking at it from the landscape lens and thinking about how different outcomes for the landscape might be facilitated through networks and other kinds of system change efforts. But what we saw as a potentially powerful addition to that was really trying to harness the vision of communities. And I was just watching actually an article where there was an Indigenous woman describing an equation, and she identified the 3 parts of the equation being people, land, and fire. And I just resonate with that so much. I've written that in so many of my reports to our federal partners about what we're trying to do. We're trying to make new arrangements between people, land, and fire. And so FACnet really tried to bring the people back into that equation and think about the people, not just as fire managers, firefighters, or prescribed fire users, but as ordinary residents, everyday people, all the people. How were these people who live in these places going to relate to fire? And so that's the question we've been pondering and sort of learning about from our members, who are amazing and doing incredible work. And so that's sort of where we started.
Yeah, and the Watershed Center, of course, what, 30-year history doing this, incredibly effective, and especially in light of all the contentiousness around this, a way to kind of create a cooperative relationship with people who are timber dependent and live in the forest. So, and your community-based organization, so successful, so long-standing, other organizations around the country also doing their great work. So why do we need a network? What was the point of organizing a network in addition to all these great community-based efforts? Why wasn't that enough?
Well, so those community-based efforts were rolling along, doing some things that they could, and speak very kindly, and I think the Watershed Center is amazing, but we're never able to actually run as far as we could see. So we had a much bigger vision than we could actually enact. And part of what's been so helpful in creating a network space for communities is that is such a common situation. So people are working in their place, they keep like hitting their head against the same wall. And so sometimes it's really nice to get into a community of practice together, into a community of people who understand the set of challenges that you're facing, even if they're slightly different from their own. And there you can find someone who might be able to actually run with your solution and idea, and maybe they can actually be successful. I can't even tell you how many times we've come up with solutions that we've been able to pilot in other places and not successfully pilot at home. And that can be really hard, but it's great to see that it wasn't a problem necessarily with the solution. It just wasn't the right time and sort of arrangement for that particular idea to be able to be useful and sort of take hold and root. And so a network provides both sort of this forum for thinking about and sharing new ideas. I think also the kind of fire management space has suffered a little bit from being narrow in its sector kind of focus and thinking about itself from a pretty technical kind of lens. And I think FACnet has really helped to expand people's thinking about that and to recognize, yes, it's really important to have scientists who know a lot of things about how fire works be involved, and have fire managers who have a lot of lived fire management experience involved. But everyday residents, people who just are living through fires, they actually have a really important narrative to add as well. And so I think by having a network, we're able to make more space for all of those voices instead of sort of just honing into experts and trying to look to them to solve sort of technical problems. The other thing it's done is like, this is really, really hard work. You saw that map. We're facing really dire challenges, across the world right now. We've really taken some bad paths here and made a lot of choices that are now limiting our choices. And so it's really nice to have community to work in when you're faced with that kind of reality, and when you need to persist and say, in spite of where we find ourselves, we are still going to try. We are going to continue. We see pathways forward to make incremental progress, and we can care about each other and bring that sort of care and attention to this work, even though it can sometimes feel insurmountable.
Yeah. What does the network look like, structurally? Like, what should be our mental image? Because we're used to conventional organizations and hierarchies. What's a network look like? What does your network look like?
Yeah, so it looks like people. And those people, I actually specifically leave people's titles off their name tags when we get together in person. I did not want people sort of using those cues to click up and sort of find people who maybe had the same job as them, or who they thought the title seemed like someone they might need to know. So I would just have people's first names on their name tags. And I used to get sort of criticism for that. And I was like, this is all you need to know. This is this person's name. Go, you need to meet everyone in this room, because everyone here really has a story that could help you. And so just to give you a little bit more than that, our actual members run the gamut in terms of the types of organizations they work for. Some of them work for municipal fire departments. Lots of them work for nonprofits. We have folks that are Indigenous people that work for their tribes. We have folks that work for sort of quasi-governmental agencies, for utilities. And so our network is made up of folks who, for the most part, work on wildfire and community resilience issues as some piece of their job. So while, I was talking before about how everyone's voice, including residents who don't work in fire, is important, and I absolutely believe that, our network is a practitioners network. So what we do is we help those practitioners, those people whose work it is to engage their communities and to work through partnerships to build wildfire resilience, and help them work with their residents. So we don't have folks who are, just homeowners or community members as part of the main network, but we do address their needs and try to elevate their voices through the network.
Great, great. What about you? How did you become involved? And what's the role of leadership or management in this network?
Yeah, so I got involved in this project when we launched the network. Like Bruce said, we, I think, first met each other in person at the launch meeting in Boise in 2013. Although I'm sure I had seen your name, Bruce, related to the Fire Learning Network, because the Watershed Center had been a member of that network prior. And so I've been working at the Watershed Center for the past 12 years, which seems impossible to me. Hayfork is actually my hometown. I grew up here and then went away to college, came back, and have been amazingly fortunate to find this job. I don't have a science background. I have a liberal arts background and actually a studio art background. But I got into this work and have learned an incredible amount just working on the job, being in the field, having the lived experience of really spending a lot of time outdoors throughout my growing up, and then working a lot with our various programs. And then I had worked a lot in program support for things like the Northern California Prescribed Fire Council, which is a project that the Watershed Center had started prior to FACNet, and the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition, which is another group that the Watershed Center had been involved with for many years that works on policy issues for rural communities. So I was really aware of a lot of the general issues and knew a lot about some of the challenges facing practitioners in place. And so actually at the first meeting, my role was very much as a support person. I was taking notes and making sure the coffee was filled, and I was basically a program person. But sort of that servant leadership approach is really how we still maintain the network. My job is not to stand in front of people. This is one of the very few times I'm in front of a room. Mostly my job is to make sure that our members are being able to share their stories and that they're getting connected to as many other people and resources as possible. So the network is really about them and their stories and their vision, and my job is to facilitate that. I think of myself often as a host or a facilitator and a champion of these people's work, and really sort of a fan of their work. So that's kind of my role.
Great, thanks. This is a class in systems thinking and practice, and I know you're very informed and influenced by systems thinking. So what would you say is the role of systems thinking and practice in the design and management of the network?
Yeah, so we have a pretty complicated conception of the issues that we're working on. Like I said, when we started FACNet, I don't think we understood all of the dimensions of the issue or what we would find as we took that journey together and sort of explored what we could do to change our relationship with fire. But we have the benefit in that bigger sort of portfolio that Bruce mentioned in the introduction. We have a set of networks and a set of amazing partners. And together we've developed kind of a pathway towards change. And it's kind of a theory of change. We're still tweaking pieces of it and sort of trying to figure out how to help our members really see themselves as situated within this much larger and long-term sort of change pathway that we're trying to develop. But I think part of what's been really successful for the network and helpful is that what we recognize is that there are lots of different kind of scales of change that we're trying to influence in that portfolio. So at its most basic level, and sort of the most important part, is making sure that our members in their places, that relationship with fire is getting better, that they are actually getting ideas, resources, connections, things that are actually helping them make a change, shift away from sort of a suppression culture and a culture that relies on other people to manage your relationship with fire, and pushes people towards whatever fire culture is really appropriate for them. And we help support people in doing that through technical services and through strategy sort of development. We talk a lot about sort of using an assets-based approach to figure out what the right fire culture might be for that place. So that's one kind of level. And our job in that is really to facilitate connections, bring in resources for those folks to make those changes. And then we also have some other kind of scales of change that we try to engage with and interact with. And sometimes that's members, and sometimes that's our sort of staff team that engages in that. So, for example, there are definitely some things at the scales of state and national governance that obviously would apply when there's a centralized fire system. So one example of some state kind of policy work that our members have engaged in is in the state of Oregon. They were redoing their smoke management plans. And so we really supported and encouraged our members to get involved in that process to make sure that they had the support they needed to show up and engage and make sure that the new smoke management rules that got written weren't going to sort of limit their ability to use prescribed fire, because that had been a real big problem in the past. And so we have some really specific kinds of initiatives that people come across and they're like, hey, we need to get engaged. And we say, well, how can we help? Do you even need our help? Often they don't need our help. They're just sort of sharing those wins and those processes with each other. And I think one of the things that's made it so we don't need a ton of governance is that we don't actually try to do a ton of national or state policy work together. So I don't use the banner of FACNet and sort of the letterhead to say, here's what FACNet thinks about this. Instead, we let individual people engage in that. We act as sort of a clearinghouse for that stuff. We make sure people are aware of it when we know that there's something that they might care about, but we don't sign on ourselves. You know, that's really, in my mind, the role of a policy coalition. There's a more efficient way to organize if that's your goal. And so what we've tried to do is instead create a culture and a community of our network that's really focused on learning and on thinking about how we can support each other's learning and each other's long-term journey toward a different relationship with fire. And we try to be very careful to not disrupt that container of learning and shared learning with forcing people to take sides on political positions, because that is it quickly goes there often. And so it's not that those things aren't important or that I can't act on those, but I don't use the network as my vehicle for that.
Yeah.
Did that kind of get at that a little bit, Bruce?
Yeah. We talked earlier in the term about self-organization and emergence, and the sort of how that contrasts with sort of a top-down or sort of a strategic plan-driven organization. It sounds like you're trying to kind of help support the energies of your members without necessarily trying to organize them into one common objective theme.
Yeah, exactly. We're not trying to create a strategy for FACNet. Our strategy for FACNet is support these members, support their development, their leadership, their vision. And then we do have some of our own sort of staff strategies, but those are not the network. So the network is part of our system and our sort of systems change vision, but it isn't the vehicle for all of that systems change. So some of the other things that are really important in our kind of vision of how we could change our fire management system is figuring out how to build alternatives. So you can't just switch from some centralized government controlled system of fire that we're all pretty reliant on right now. I think very few people are gonna be like, sign me up to just say no one should come if there's a fire. And so we're trying to create alternatives so that over time we can actually make different choices. And so that requires us engaging with that existing system, trying to help make it better, trying to find ways for communities to have access to decision making, to see where it's really failing and figure out what we can do to sort of prop that up, and at the same time creating systems so that we aren't just propping up a crumbling and deteriorating system that is wholly insufficient to meet our needs, and also continues us on this path of separation between communities and their responsibility as humans to engage with fire.
Yeah,
And I think
yeah.
that's really fundamental to what we're doing, is that we're asking more and more people to be involved in that relationship than our current system makes space for.
It sounds almost like the calls for defunding the police. It's not let's get rid of a police force or not have security. It's let's transition to an alternative system that empowers the community.
Exactly. I often think of it as like, shifting a car. You don't want to just like throw it from like fourth gear into reverse. You've got to like think about how you're going to make a transition to try to manage the disruption that's going to happen. Most of us are really used to there being response and suppression capabilities. And I think more and more over the last 5 years, especially, I think if folks watch the news, you can see that our suppression capabilities have been outstripped by the power of fire and the choices we've made to get us into this place. And yet, I don't think that the answer is, well, just, pull out of fire altogether. But I think the danger is that the system will double down to support its own existence. And I think that that is a common sort of system function. Like power is going to try to keep itself in power, and the system's going to try to keep itself going. And so I think there's a real danger here in doubling down on unlimited money for a fire fight, which is really common terminology that we hear about fire, and I think really destructive to our ability to see other ways to relate to fire.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks. I wanted to transition to the ideas that were raised in the paper that was assigned for today, and that focused specifically on this idea of self-generating networks. How do you organize networks so that they develop their own internal sort of sustaining energy? What is this idea of virtuous cycles? Is that something that you can relate to, that you see circulating in FactNet?
Yeah, I definitely think that it was one of the things we did really early on was think about how to focus on relationships in our network, and on not necessarily creating expectations, but on creating a culture that was pretty clear about reciprocity being at the center of what was going to generate value for people, and recognizing that it wasn't, a single expert in the center. It wasn't a leader. It wasn't a charismatic leader in the center. That what really needed to be our shared vision of the engine of what was going to create value for all of us was all of our own goodwill toward each other and our passion and interest in this domain, in thinking about how we could have a different future with fire. And so by putting that at the center, I think we really created a great condition for ourselves to make that flywheel go. Instead of being reliant on a specific person or a good speaker, we knew that everyone was sort of feeding their energy into caring about each other. And we did that even in the sort of most mechanical ways. So as staff, we have a sort of forum for our members, and we made sure that if anybody asked a question on there, that they got at least one answer. So we didn't want any needs to kind of go just completely ignored. And so we really put a ton of staff time and energy into making sure that we could kind of push that forward so that people could see, oh, I'm getting value here, and now I want to give value back. Because not sort of in a transactional way of like, I gave one thing, now I need to get one thing, but sort of a feeling an affinity as this is my community. This is the place I'm going to turn when I need help. And this is also the place I'm going to turn when I want to celebrate, when I want to share, when I want to be in community with other people. And so we tried to really reinforce that through all of the systems we built and all of the interactions and relationships that we as staff have, as well as that we tried to cultivate among members. And I think that has been the most successful thing that we've done, hands down.
Yeah. So you sort of jumpstart these cycles and then nurture them, kind of keep them going. Can you think of an example of something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like some of the things we've done to really help people get to know each other, we've invested a lot in people getting to know each other on a personal and a professional level. And so we did a whole like StoryCorps kind of approach, where we had people interview each other and really try to get to know each other beyond what a typical sort of professional relationship might provide you. And I think that that exercise has made the kinds of connections that will be more durable. You know, people in our network call each other friends, not, oh, well, that's this random professional association I'm involved with. And I think that, you know, there's pros and cons to that, I'm sure, but I really do think that that has been the key to us having this sort of the version of a virtuous cycle that's about people wanting to keep giving and keep showing up, because we're not making them. This is where they come to kind of get taken care of. You know, people describe our annual workshop as, you know, their favorite thing that they do all year, and the place where they come to get rejuvenated to like sort of face the next year. And I think that, you know, that takes a lot of work to like put something like that on, but that's been our total focus, is to make sure that that is true and that that continues to be true even over time.
Yeah. You know, the concept of co-work was featured in this piece. And
Mhm.
I know you have a somewhat complicated relationship with the idea that the idea of sort of getting people together to do focused work together as a way of community building is not necessarily entirely resonate with your approach. Can you help me develop that idea?
Yeah, so we definitely we tried to do some co-work early on. I think we sort of looked at like a lot of our own mental models of like how people were going to do stuff, and we're like, well, let's identify, let's make some work groups. And we actually tried to launch some communities of practice, which people immediately tried to turn into working groups because of their own experience and just they thought, oh, if we're put in groups, we should like develop, we should need to produce something. And so we really, I felt like we had to sort of go against the current there and try to encourage them, no, just learn about this thing together. You don't have to produce something. So I think it gets back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of scale. And one of the benefits of working on an issue like fire adaptation with the kind of solution that we are trying to promote, which is about diversifying power and access to different opportunities, is that you don't actually need to do a bunch of work together as the network. The folks who need to do co-work are in place. Like you need partners in place that are taking action, that are taking coordinated action, that are building a different culture and relationship with fire. But at the network scale, at that national scale, sometimes there's a little bit of co-work we can do, but mostly what we do is we learn about what each other is already doing. And so we aren't trying to put a ton of energy and sort of get into tussles around, well, what's the right way? And how should we like write this quick guide? Or whose model for this do we want to hold up? And that's really helped us because we haven't had to get into those kinds of judgments around what people were doing. We've been able to kind of respect the fact that people are going to do lots of different things. They know better their local partners, their local needs, and their culture, and what needs to change about that than we do. And we are not going to judge those activities. If they ask and want like thinking partnership and strategic help, we certainly engage in that, but it's not something that the network is sort of designed around. We're not set out to critique one another. We're set out to hear one another, to celebrate one another, to sort of cheer one another on as we go back and do that work at home. And so,
Yeah, I get a
go ahead.
real sense that you don't see this as a thing in isolation, that it's sort of a complement to an existing system and an existing set of relationships and activities, sort
Absolutely,
of
that we can't
value added.
and we can't possibly hope to engage on that local scale. And I know that so deeply from working and living in Hayfork. There's no way an outside person could come here and try to explain to me how to better work with the Shasta Trinity National Forest and our other partners. We know what's working and what's not working. And it's what we really need is a community who we can um, sort of be in community with, not a people to tell us to do something in a different way or do a SWOT analysis of what we're doing. Like that's really not going to help us. What we need is to persist. We need great new models and ideas that people share about things they've tried, interventions they've used. And we don't need to sort of decide on a unified vision. I think the other thing about this co-work that just doesn't work at that scale is that there's really very few things that we would like to replace at that centralized scale. We're not trying to build an alternative centralized fire management system that's just run by somebody else. We don't want that. We want a system that is dispersed and local.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I know, Gail and Sarah at Reamp described, well, Gail was here and described this very deliberate systems analysis that they did that identified the leverage points for change in their system, and then they coordinated everyone around those. It sounds like you have a very different approach.
Yeah, super different. While we know a lot about the fire management system that we have, and how that works, I think our vision of change isn't necessarily about trying to create coordinated action to modify that system in small ways. We want everyone who has to engage with that system to find the cracks, shore them up when you have to, and chip away at them when you think you can get away with it. And so that's what we're really trying to do, is not create like a really clear pathway that's about where the levers are and who's going to pull them at which times and which committees they're going to do that. That's not at all what we're trying to do. And I think there could be critiques of that, but I think that for what we've been doing, I think that it really has been supporting really dramatic change on the ground. So I think I saw a couple of chats pop up about that. So
I see one from Kara that's relevant, I think, to what you're talking about now, which is if success isn't predefined as, hitting that leverage point and hitting it hard, what does success look like? What is the positive change that you can point to and say we're proud of that? We were instrumental in that change.
Yeah. So well, a few different things. So we did an evaluation of FactNet where we sort of looked at 3 different dimensions of the network. So we did a social network analysis to look at connectivity among members, and we learned a lot about just our own network structure and like how connected people were. We also did a scorecard that helped us understand the kinds of value that people were getting and the changes to their work on the ground that were happening because of that. And then we did some ripple effects mapping, which is a process where you do storytelling and you get a group together to learn about different influences and sort of outcomes that have happened based on something that started. And so those 3 things together have told us a lot. We also, our staff is mostly dedicated to directly working with members. So we know a lot about what's going on. Our members call us to complain if there's a problem about what they're doing on the ground. They call us to celebrate. So we really get intimate knowledge about what's happening. And so we can see over time a lot of really transformed programs on the ground. So we also did some work to look at all of the practices that people were trying to implement on the ground. Like, what was their full suite of fire adaptation work when we started working with them? And we can look at that now and see that I think and I'm going to maybe get these stats a little bit wrong, but I think 92% of our members have added at least one dimension to their work locally around fire adaptation, if not more than one. 100% of members say they get value personally from being engaged in the network. We have a whole bunch of sort of findings from that evaluation that help us understand what specifically we're changing. And our vision of what needs to change is that those local leaders need to be sustained and supported and connected, and they need to be expanding their vision of what living with fire means. And so those 2 stats I gave are sort of top of my mind because they're really our framework for success. Our sort of core theory of change is that you can't change local culture without local leaders sort of moving that. And so we want to invest in those people and their ability to operate in their place in an autonomous way that leads to the right outcomes for those people in that place. And then we need them to be getting value from their participation in the network. And we need them to be not just sort of adopting additional sort of nationally available programming, although that can be great. And there's a lot of great programs out there. We're not just trying to dial in best practices for the system we already have. So we really want people pushing the boundaries and thinking about, what could I do that is sort of more game changing here? So yes, I need to still host the day when I do debris collection because we don't want people not doing their defensible space because there's nowhere to put the vegetation they cut away. So we certainly wouldn't want to, dissuade people from that kind of core programmatic work that they've been doing. But we don't want them to stop there and just say, well, this is what we've built, because that just accepts the system as it is and says, well, do your best. And what we really want is for people to think more creatively about how they could engage their partners, their utilities, their fire departments, their residents in thinking differently about how fire could operate in their place. And so that's when I feel like we've made a big difference.
Yeah, I hear you. It's so instead of specific outcomes, it's kind of building the capacity of local
Yes.
leaders in the system. Is
Yes.
is a piece of that kind of to and this kind of response, I think, to Camilla's question, is to sort of have the members govern the network or take control of the network, is to sort of share the authority or the leadership of the network. Is that a part of capacity building?
Yeah. So I think, we have a ton of shared leadership in our network.
Hmm.
The network is something that I think we even talk about it as like this shared thing that we've all created together, and we have a shared responsibility to it. So we really
Hmm.
think of it as its own entity that we've all built together and contributed to together. And it's almost like our child, like that we all have to care for together and nurture. And so everyone has responsibility in that. In terms of sort of governing resources and other choices, we've asked members over and over about sort of the backroom kind of operations of the network. And we have heard over and over from those folks that they don't want to be involved in that. They are very busy, focused on working on trying to manage their fire programs on the ground, and they want us to run the network. They are happy with what we're doing. We ask for feedback constantly from them about every single thing we do. We get, we have evaluations about every event, every learning opportunity, every training, and we make real changes based on their feedback. And we then go back to them and we say, this is what we heard from you. This is how we're responding. And so I think we've built a lot of trust with them to steward our sort of shared resources in that way. We also have some funding that we're able to give to some of our core members. And we have a variety of membership levels. I'm not going to get into all those details because I don't think it's relevant, but we're able to monetarily support some of those key leaders who are our people who are putting the most back into the network, and who we can also then support to sort of offset some of their time. And some of the folks who are in the core network don't need that funding. They might work for a fire department and just like their position is already funded from local taxes. But sometimes we have people whose jobs are not funded and they would not be able to participate if we weren't able to support them. And so we have those resources and we use them and we try to apply them in really transparent and clear ways. And so that I think we've created a system where we don't need to govern that so much, because we have set up a transparent and clear system about how to access those resources and what they're for.
Yeah. I want to riff off Kara's last question there, which is, so a lot of your funding comes from the Forest Service itself.
Yes.
And yet what you're talking about is kind of shifting power away from the Forest Service. Why on earth would they support something that would disempower them?
Well, because they know that they can't do what needs to be done. The people at the Forest Service who are our partners are incredible. They are very aware of the limitations of their agency and of the kind of cumulative situation that we find ourselves in, and that their inability to meet that situation in a way that will come up with better outcomes. And so they know that they need partners on the ground working. There's an entire initiative in the Forest Service that was launched, I think, like 15 months ago, called Shared Stewardship, which is sort of tries to codify and articulate the same kind of ethic around like, hey, so all those federal public lands, we might actually need some help taking care of them, and like states and local people might need to be involved. And so it's not just this isn't just the only example of where the Forest Service is recognizing that they need to be engaged with partners. There's a long history of the Forest Service engaging with local partners, because they really realize, and they are not setting out to sort of own the world. Now, the fire management system, on the other hand, is a little bit different story. And I think that that system may have some ideas about its capabilities that might be overblown. But I think even people who work in that system understand that, like, hey, you know, I think we actually just dropped a level of our there's a system called preparedness level that talks about how many resources are available to order if there's a fire. And the highest level is PL5. And we had been at PL5 for like weeks. Every firefighting resource that was available to be ordered was already on a fire, is what that means. And that's a really scary place to be in for weeks. If you have a system where your most used method is to put suppression resources out to stop a fire. If you don't have any more suppression resources that you can put on the game board, you kind of you're going to lose. And so I think that people who work in that recognize, wait a minute, we actually don't have what we need if we actually wanted to double down and keep just doing suppression. Now, will that stop people from having schemes about doing that? I am concerned that it will not. But I think, you know, most of the leadership, you know, has a sense of reality about what's actually going on the ground and know that they need help and partners.
Yeah, yeah. So before we go to quick breakout groups, and I'm going to ask you if I can even drop you into one, I wanted to ask you a question about sort of how do we build capacity amongst ourselves and in this program to be systems change leaders? And, you know, in a way that's a very different kind of goal than being a conventional kind of top-down leader in a regulatory agency or something like that. So what would you say are the kind of skills that a systems change leader should try to acquire in order to be effective in the field as a practitioner?
Yeah, I mean, this is probably going to seem a little bit like basic, but just like people who like to learn, who want to know everything they can about everything, and who want to build sort of a constellation map of how it's all connected. Like, this is probably for you if you're excited about that. If you're not excited about that, I'm not sure you might really want to do that. So I think, you know, sort of cultivate excitement and learning and curiosity. I think not getting stuck in thinking about being in a certain sector. I think that we're really plagued by that. And there's so many crazy silos that have been created. I see it all the time in our fire management system that really stop us from actually creating an alternative system. And so I think being willing to push against that, to go be the person who's going to be like, so what is your sector all about? How can I learn what public health is? And what are people doing in this realm? And not being afraid to see that, oh, that might actually be related to fire. Not that you all want to be working in fire, but anyone who does want to work in fire, I'd love to meet you. So I think those are two main things. I also think getting some like real life experience with the system that you want to work in is really important. So, you know, Bruce asked me about my background, and I think that my credibility has been bolstered quite a bit with folks in the network by the fact that I live in a place that should be burning every 5 to 15 years. I've seen many fires over my lifetime living in Trinity County. And so, you know, fire is a part of my life. And I think it's really important. If you want to fix things and work on alternative systems, you got to know how they work. And so you should immerse yourself in that and try to become involved in the mechanics of that so that you can figure out, well, what piece of this could I make better? What's my vision of something different that I could bring to this system? So those are a few ideas.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. So in transition now, I'd like to drop us all into breakout groups. And I might mix up a few if they seem small and just to make the right size. So if you get teleported, you'll know why. And Michelle, if it's okay with you, I'll drop you into one of them randomly. Sure, and just spend a few minutes talking and maybe come back with a question or an observation. So talk about what you've heard, what you've learned, what you're curious about, and come back when we all come back. Let's see if the different groups have one question or observation they'd like to share. So we'll do a quick round robin amongst the groups. So each group appoints someone to capture your question or observation. And I'll just hit the breakout room button. And you're off. Oops, a bunch of people aren't assigned. Well, that's not a problem. I'll just pop you in different places. Wildfire group should be a popular place. Just hitting a lot of assignment buttons right now, so you'll get it. You get teleported in a moment. Okay, I think everyone's off.